Imagine showing up to count fish in a California river, clipboard in hand, waders on, the whole deal, and the numbers you pull back are so far outside what any model predicted that you and your entire team just stand there in the stream, staring at each other. That is exactly what happened to researchers working the Scott River watershed in Northern California. And the twist? The thing responsible for those numbers wasn't a cutting-edge bioengineered solution. It wasn't a $100 million dam removal. It was a pile of sticks woven between wooden posts. Fake beaver dams, and the salmon went absolutely wild for them. By the late 1990s, Central California coast coho salmon were on the verge of extinction. Let that sink in. Coho salmon run sizes had decreased by 80 to 90% from the 1940s. Historical records show that coho salmon occurred in 582 California streams, but by 1991 had been lost from about half of those streams. Coastal development, the construction of dams, the eradication of beavers, and water diversions for agriculture had reduced the amount of habitat available to the fish. The rivers had been gutted, not just of water, but of complexity, the deep, cool, slow-water refuges that young salmon desperately need to survive a California summer, gone. And without beavers to build them, nobody was putting them back. Then the drought hit, and not a little drought. Minimal rainfall and lack of snowfall during the fall and winter of 2013 to 2014 resulted in low stream flows throughout the Scott River watershed, with many tributary streams experiencing flows so low they were not even connected to the main stem Scott River until mid-February. Approximately 2,700 adult coho salmon had ascended the Scott River to spawn that season, and being unable to reach their tributary spawning grounds, many spawned within a 10-mile reach of the Scott River main stem. Picture that, thousands of fish trapped, burning through their energy reserves, trying to spawn in the wrong place because the right places had simply dried up. The emergency response was surreal. California Trout and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, along with partners, relocated more than 30,000 juvenile coho salmon physically trucked out because those fish had become stranded upstream during extreme drought conditions. 30,000 fish in trucks on a highway. This was salmon conservation in crisis mode, and everyone involved knew it couldn't be the long-term answer. So the Scott River Watershed Council, a local community group, not a federal agency, not a Silicon Valley startup, decided to try something different, something that looked almost embarrassingly simple. The Scott River Basin in Northern California became the first place in the state where watershed restoration using beaver dam analogs, in-stream post, and vegetation weave structures that mimic natural beaver dams was tried. It started in 2014 as an initiative of a local community group with technical support from a national oceanic and atmospheric administration scientist. The method? Drive a row of narrow logs into a stream bed and then weave the pilings together with cuttings sourced from nearby trees. That's it. No concrete, no turbines, no environmental impact review the size of a phone book, logs, sticks, weaving. Now here's where it gets interesting, because the skeptics were loud. The conventional thinking in fisheries management had always treated anything spanning a stream channel as a potential barrier. A dam is a dam, right? Regulators and engineers applied fish passage rules designed for massive concrete structures to these little woven stick walls. Debate continued as to the benefits of beaver dams, primarily because dams are perceived as barriers to fish movement, particularly migratory species such as salmonids. The objection makes intuitive sense. You're building something across a river where endangered fish need to swim. What could go wrong? Everything about that framing, it turns out, was wrong. Here's what the researchers actually asked. Have salmon and beavers ever coexisted? The answer floored the skeptics. Beaver ponds and salmon have coexisted in North America since before the Pliocene, at least 7.5 million years ago. These fish didn't evolve in open, fast-flowing, beaver-free channels. They evolved in a landscape full of beaver ponds. Because these salmonids have evolved in the presence of beaver dams for millions of years, researchers hypothesized that they have also evolved strategies for crossing them, and that by constructing dams similar to beaver dams in terms of size, location, and materials, the fish would also be able to cross these human-built structures. So, quick question before we get to the data, because this is genuinely a fork-in-the-road moment. If you were a skeptical researcher in 2015, would you have voted to build the fake beaver dams, or would you have argued they were too risky for an already endangered fish population? Comment your answer below, because the answer the data gave was not what most people expected. The first monitoring results started coming back, and the numbers were, in a word, staggering. BDA restoration increased the area and capacity of coho salmon habitat. Specifically, restoration in Sugar Creek alone created 7,080 square meters of habitat, which researchers calculated could support 6,744 juvenile coho. That's habitat conjured from sticks and posts in a stream that had been running bone dry. Upstream of the dams, researchers found an abundance of juvenile salmonids and a several orders of magnitude difference in favor of the number of juveniles using the pond habitat upstream of the dam. Several orders of magnitude in ecology, that's not a result. That's a jaw-drop moment. Then came the survival data, and this is the number that converted the skeptics. Researchers estimated the coho survival from summer of 2017 through the 2018 spring outmigration to be 88%, based on detection of 863 tagged coho during the spring outmigration out of 1,077 tagged the previous summer and fall. 88% survival through a California drought summer. For context, decades of legacy land use impacts, channel simplification, incision, and reduced riparian cover had degraded habitat complexity, limited floodplain connectivity, and contributed to stressful seasonal conditions for juvenile salmonids, particularly during drought years. These were the same streams that had been running dry and killing fish for generations. How did a pile of woven sticks pull off 88% survival? The mechanism is elegant. BDAs increase total habitat and retention of water on the landscape, contributing to lower water temperatures and higher base flows. By generating habitat that is resilient to drought, BDAs improve coho performance generally, and more specifically in the face of climate stress. The fake dam slows the water down. Slowing water down raises the water table. A higher water table keeps the stream wet longer into the dry season. Cooler, deeper, slower water is exactly what a juvenile coho needs to survive a summer that would otherwise cook it. The BDA doesn't fight the drought. It buys the fish time. Habitat restoration by BDA replicated some of the cool, wetted habitat that was historically available to coho salmon in the Scott Valley, which increased juvenile coho survival and adult returns. Adult returns, that's the full circle moment. Fish that survived as juveniles in BDA ponds grew up, went to sea, and came back. Following the installation of beaver dam analogs, researchers observed significant increases in the density, survival, and production of juvenile steelhead without impacting upstream and downstream migrations. The barrier argument, the whole reason people were skeptical in the first place, turned out to be essentially a non-issue at the scale of these structures. And then there's the bonus nobody planned for. Beavers have been active or have taken over maintenance of BDAs at all sites. The fake dams became real dams. The beavers showed up, looked at the humans' work, apparently decided it was acceptable, and moved in. Such structures are intended to mimic the form and function of beaver dams, and under ideal conditions, they are eventually colonized by beaver. You don't just get a pond, you get a self-maintaining pond. The restoration tool recruits its own maintenance crew. Beaver exploitation had eliminated considerable amounts of climate-resilient coho habitat, leaving remnant habitats that track air temperature and water scarcity more tightly and to a greater degree than under historic conditions. That is the real story underneath the story. California's rivers weren't just degraded by dams and agriculture. They were degraded by the erasure of an entire ecosystem engineer, the beaver, whose absence made every drought worse and every restoration effort harder. The BDA is, in a very real sense, a beaver substitute, a placeholder for a species that was nearly trapped out of existence, whose ecological legacy is now being rebuilt with posts and willow branches and a lot of determination from people in waders. Across Eurasia and North America, beavers, their dams, and their human-built analogs are becoming increasingly common restoration tools to facilitate recovery of streams and wetlands, providing a natural and cost-effective means of restoring dynamic fluvial ecosystems. The key word there is cost-effective. When you compare the price of trucking 30,000 juvenile salmon down a California highway to the price of pounding wooden posts into a stream bed and weaving willow between them, the math is not even close. The low-tech solution is winning on every metric researchers can measure: habitat area, juvenile survival, adult returns, cost per fish, and drought resilience. The moment the evidence forced a rethink wasn't a single dramatic conference presentation. It was quieter than that. It was researchers standing in the Scott River watershed, counting fish in ponds that shouldn't have existed during a drought that should have emptied these streams entirely, writing down numbers that didn't match any prior model. It was the slow, uncomfortable realization that the thing they'd been skeptical of, a stick dam built by a community group with no technical support, had outperformed everything else tried in that watershed. In the Klamath River Basin, research suggested that coho salmon growth and survival was similar or higher in BDA sites when compared to reference sites. What this story forces us to rethink is the entire hierarchy of river restoration. The assumption had always been that bigger, more engineered, more expensive interventions were more effective. The BDA data says otherwise. Sometimes the most powerful restoration tool is the one that works with the biology of a species, rather than imposing a human engineering solution on top of it. Coho salmon don't need a fish ladder, they need a beaver pond. They've needed one for 7.5 million years. We just spent a century removing every last one. The sticks are going back in, the fish are coming back with them, and the researchers who stood in those streams shaking their heads at numbers they couldn't explain. Most of them are now among the loudest advocates for scaling this up. That's what good science does. It follows the data, even when the data looks like a pile of woven branches in a dried-up creek. If this story got your brain firing, share it with someone who thinks conservation has to be complicated to work. And subscribe, because the most interesting ecological plot twists are always the ones where the simplest solution turns out to be the right one. And there are a lot more of those stories where this came from.